Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. On this week's episode, I want to talk about constructing identity and the way in which our identities are constructed. So we quite commonly think about our identity as something that we make, right? That I want to be my best self, or I want to improve in a certain area, or I've got this self-talk and I want to modify this self-talk or get rid of it even. And that really plays into the notion that our identity is something that we control, and if there's something that's not working for us, whatever that is, that we need to remove it. We might think, okay, well, I'll surgically remove it, or we might think I'll therapeutically remove it. However we conceptualize that idea, it is this thing within us that we are trying to deal with by simply just pulling out of ourselves, or through some process, retraining, for example. So if you think about behavioral therapy, the idea is that you're changing the behavior. When you get into cognitive therapy, you're getting into this idea that there's a cognitive relationship to our behavior. When you get into dialectical behavior, you're getting into this notion that there's these oppositions, good, bad, right, wrong, so on and so forth. And that through one of these methods or all of these methods, we can engage ourselves, this internal experience, in a manner that allows us to reshape our lives and therefore reshape our identity. So that's not what this podcast is about. This podcast is about the external or the extrinsic things that exist in our lives that create the context, create the rules of the game, if you will. So I'll use this as an example probably throughout, but we'll jump around a bit. So the first example is teacher and student. Now, this can be parent and child, of course, or boss and employee, or whatever it is, but just this idea of a teacher and a student. So if I said to you, what makes a teacher a teacher? You might say, well, they have experience, they have expertise. You might say that they have certifications of some kind. They've gone to school or been in whatever way educated. You might say that they have been a part of a teaching community, right? That there's a kind of community or social aspect to what you're doing. You might say that they've received accolades. They've won awards, or they've gotten promotions, or whatever it is. And all of these things taken together play into the assumptions, and they vary and they change within each of us, but they play into the assumptions that we have of what a teacher is. Now, if I said, well, what's a student? You say, okay, well, a student is somebody who is learning, who is there to learn, right? They are taking a course to better themselves in some way. You could say a student is learning how to fit into society. School systems function as a socialization instrument, that is, teaching people how to exist in society, teaching students how to then become good workers. So you can say, well, there's a socialization function. You could say there's a betterment function. It's an opportunity for a student to grow and evolve. They're getting new ideas, they're exploring ideas, and so on and so forth. Whatever your idea of education is, and again, it is going to be different based upon your own implicit assumptions about the meaning of education. So I might say to somebody, what's education? And they might say, it's something that I have to do to get to where I want to go in life. It's a stepping stone. Somebody else might say it's an opportunity for me to explore and understand. Each thinking and each terming those experiences, those interpretations, as education. But if we take a step back, what we've actually done is we've created a construct of teacher and student. In other words, we've already set in place a structure for understanding a relationship, even though we are interpreting this relationship in a different way, which is to say, my interpretation of what being a teacher is or what being a student is may vary, and will most likely vary, certainly as we really drill down, than your interpretation of what a teacher is, what a student is. So what this means is there's an interpretation process going on, a hermeneutic process going on, that I am interpreting my place in the world, my place in the world, and there is a structure. Now, in the beginning of the podcast, I talked about what we're not talking about. here we can just circle back just to emphasize this point that what we're not talking about is, oh, I need to change myself to adhere to this external structure, right? I need to modify my behavior, my cognitions. I need to think of opposites and various options and ways in which I can reshape the dialogue, the narrative that I'm hearing inside my head. What we're talking about here is the extrinsic structure, the external structure, and how does that shape the world? So in thinking about that, and in thinking about these implicit assumptions that we have, is it possible that we are operating within a premise that is itself problematic? So now let's take a look at gender, for example. So what does it mean to be born a man? What does it mean, or a male? What does it mean to be born a female? Now, yes, within that, a person can be born biologically one and identify as the other, which further emphasizes the way in which an individual is distinct from the structures within which they are defined. So, in a kind of general sense of let's just look at it as a binary sense, and we can go further from that. But in a binary sense, are there examples of people preferring the birth of one child based upon gender than another? Now, what that demonstrates is it demonstrates the way in which the structure of gender, period, has a meaning that a parent or parents want to associate or to in some way be a part of. That is, they see having a child born of a certain gender as creating a structure for that child and for themselves that is better than the child being born of another gender. Now let's take a look at race. This is going to sound silly, but I'm going to ask them, and hopefully the silliness helps illustrate the point, but is there a difference in how we understand race? Clearly there is. Is there a bias that goes into so-called racial distinctions? And I say so-called because, again, these have been structurally defined as something, right? So we are structurally defining the color of one's hair, the color of one's skin, the color of one's eyes, the height, the weight, all of these different things that we then say because of this color, right? The color of a person's skin, the pigment of their skin, all of these things are or are not available to them within this context. Now, this is a podcast about how our identity is shaped by these cultural and social influences. And so it's pretty apparent to see how gender and race are shaped by social constructs. Now, what this does is it has a kind of method of alienating ourselves. So, for example, let's say I'm a racist and I'm in a racist group with other racists and we talk about racist things. And I have a community, there's romantic relationships, there's friend relationships, there's support networks, there's all of these different community type things. But something happens and I start to question whether or not I believe in this ideology of race and this ideology of racism, that is, the hate of another based upon some quote-unquote racial attribute. If my relationship in that community was fundamental, which is to say, if it was not dependent upon my way of adhering to this external structure of racism, then I would be accepted. They would say, oh, well, Jordan was a racist, but he's not anymore. But he's one of us because our connection is not based upon our ideology. Our connection is based upon the fact that we've had these bonds and these connections and we've known each other for a certain amount of time and we've shared and we've grown, all this kind of stuff. But of course, what happens is because of the external construct of racism as being the fundamental to the relationship, I am then alienated and I perceive this. So this is to emphasize the way in which the external structure creates a reality that is not simply something we can just walk away from. Now, why does that matter? Well, again, turning back to the beginning of the podcast and what we're not talking about in this podcast, is it runs the risk And I wouldn't even say runs the risk. I would say it does, in fact, burden the individual with the paradox of the social construct of society as being the individual's burden. So, from an existential perspective, what does this mean? How does this start to unfold? Well, if I have a fundamental need for connection, and the only way to achieve that connection is to adhere to an external structure of belief, but that external structure of belief is not authentic, then I am faced with the question of, do I move towards my authenticity, or do I adhere to something that is inauthentic to preserve my space within this constructed universe? Put another way, and perhaps more bluntly, can I speak, or will I be punished? Can I express, or will I be exiled? Can I doubt, or will I be harmed? Am I able, within the structure that I'm in, to be free? Or is my freedom, expressing that I'm no longer a racist, for example, is my freedom itself seen as danger? And the question is, if my freedom is perceived as danger, then what is it a danger to? So let's circle back to the teacher-student conversation. And what's interesting, I'm currently a student at Yorkville University, and one of the first forms in the practicum as they send out has to do with the roles and the things that you will do as a student. And it lays out in a somewhat, and to me, what is a very, I'm not even sure the term, it just feels like we're turning the relationship into a series of things on a checklist. So we're going to respect each other, we're going to listen to each other, we're going to acknowledge that the teacher has knowledge and that we are learning from the teacher, so we're going to humble ourselves in effect. So it kind of takes the relationship or the interpersonal dynamic and gives it a protocol. Now, why is this a thing? Well, it's a thing not because of the school I'm at, because it's a thing because this is how we have structured so many of our relationships, right? So if you do something online banking or you buy something online, you get a survey. Tell us how you felt. Tell us what you were thinking. It's trying to, in some way, quantify the relationship dynamic, which is operating within an extrinsic structure system. In other words, I can't really say what I feel. I can't really, for example, not tick if the boxes that are available to me do not, in fact, reflect my views, I'm faced with that question I mentioned earlier, that paradox I mentioned earlier. Do I not do the survey because it is not authentic to my actual experience, or do I do the survey to fit into their system? In general terms, do I commit to my own beliefs, or do I sell out to the extrinsic structure and I say, oh, well, it's good enough, or oh, well, nobody cares, or whatever? And does that in and of itself create a form of apathy that is embedded in the structure itself, which undermines an individual saying, actually, the options you gave me don't really reflect who I am? So if we look back at gender, for example, if a woman doesn't have rights, if there's no box for her to say, I'm a woman, is it authentic for her to say, well, I am a woman, I can't, tick the man box because all they have is one box, let's say, or I'm gay, or I'm whatever I am. And we realize, oh, well, the categories that they are using to structure the information that's going into this overarching system, right, of identity, right? There's men, there's women, and so on and so forth. This overarching structure actually isn't nuanced enough to be able to see me. So I'm going to not answer it. But again, not answering it is taken as being this rebelling against, this antagonism, this not going with the flow. Oh, well, just give them what they want. But why is that so important? Well, again, from the existential point of view and that existential paradox, remembering that we've actually come to a crossroads. We've actually come to this point where we are thinking, okay, this form does not really reflect me. This questionnaire does not really reflect me. Or it does 60% and not 40%, or whatever the ratio is. Do I take the time to talk to somebody about this? Do I write about it? Do I do a podcast about it? Or do I just say, who cares? What I'm kind of putting forward here is this who cares is our way of dealing with the fact that there is so much coming at us that it becomes, in a sense, easier for us to say, and not easier in an experiential way, but easier in a systematic way, easier for us to say, I'm just going to work on myself. I'm going to work on my best self. I'm going to work on my whatever self, and I'm going to try and make myself happy because I don't know how to deal with a society that every time I have to fill out a form, every time I have to interact with, or an organization, I'm interacting with computers and forms and checklists and all that stuff, and I just give up. This places a tremendous burden on the individual to get the extrinsic attachment needs from oneself. Right now, I'm in a situation where I've kind of accepted the fact, not kind of, I have implicitly accepted the fact that I am not going to get the form of acceptance from, my school, and it's saying, here's the form, and this is our structure of the way teachers and students are, sign and agree to this, where I'm thinking, this is deeply problematic from a level of oppression. This is deeply problematic from an intersubjective perspective. This is deeply problematic from a relational perspective. This is deeply problematic from a culturally responsive and socially just perspective. This is deeply problematic from a postmodern perspective. Yet, there is no box to tick any of those things. And which is then becoming this implicit gesture of, well, just go with the flow. So what I do is I make a podcast. What I do is I start to think about how are these structures actually transforming our freedom, which is the thoughts that I have, the ideas that I have, into this thing that I should just do on my own. And then as for society, I should just go along to get along because there's nothing I can do anyway. And what effect might that have over the course of my life? So if we circle back to the racist example, and I'm a racist in a group of people who are racist, and I decide to challenge racism, I say, well, I no longer believe these racist things. I no longer think what we're doing as racist makes sense. So I like all of you people. I want to keep on hanging out with you. You're my community. You're my this. You're my that. But I just don't believe in this thing that we're doing called being racist. They are going to kick me out, right? The awareness that I am bringing to this experience is in and of itself a threat. Now let's go to the school example. School sends me a form or sends you a form, or a bank sends you a form after an interaction, or it doesn't really matter. You get sent a form and you think, okay, well, this doesn't really make sense. Do you say, well, I'm going to interact with this? You're like, I don't have time, right? I don't have time for this fight. I got to pick my battles, and this is not a battle I can pick. So what I'm suggesting is, and what I'm curious about is there a way for us to acknowledge within our own experience that we may not have time to pick the fight, to think about it for hours on end, to try and find the person to talk to start a group, to transform, to whatever. We may not have time. But is there something we can do that acknowledges that this structure, this extrinsic structure, is actually functioning in a way that interprets our freedom as a danger, and we are saying there's nothing I can do as a way to managing? Is there another way that we can manage the fact that it as a system will not acknowledge me as an individual because for its own purpose and its own needs and its own end, its own means and its ends and so on, for its own structure, it has a goal in mind. So with the teaching example, which can be applied to parental things, boss and employee and so on and so forth, what is happening is this extrinsic relationship is being defined as a quote-unquote efficient way of engaging this relationship towards some end. You're going to get accreditation, you're going to get a mark, you're going to get blah, 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 blah. And so the goal is to get that thing. And if you do well, then you obviously pass. And if you don't, you fail. So you get fired or you get kicked out of school or whatever it is. That is clearly an extrinsic structure, the rules of the game, which has a winner and has a loser. This is a form of understanding our relationships that is not particularly involved when you consider postmodern, when you consider intersubjective, when you consider relational dynamics, that the experience of a relationship is the experience of a new dynamic, referred to by some in the intersubjective field as the third. But we can just call it more generally the experience of the relationship as the relationship unto itself, which is to say, it is not this or that, you or them. It is this new dynamic. And the potential here is to create, to genuinely create something that is not you or the other person, but yet at the same time is only possible because of the relationship you and this other person have. So there is something truly magnificent created, but it may, in and of itself, expose a form of freedom that is viewed as a threat by an extrinsic system. For example, in the teacher-student dynamic, if the teachers and students are all teachers and students, in other words, the students are teaching the teachers sometimes and vice versa, if it is completely a lateral, open, transparent relationship that individuals are sharing it through a form of curiosity of, well, what's being created through us right now? What is the third that is being created in our relationship? Does that threaten any form of hierarchical structure? And the answer, of course, is yes, right? If I'm a racist in a racist group of people and I say, you know what, I don't think I'm racist anymore, it threatens the organization as a racist organization. Whereas if I'm in that racist organization and I say, well, why don't we explore our relationships with these people that were racist again? Because maybe there's something within that relationship that is interesting, that is beautiful, that has potential, that actually may bring vitality to our experience. But the fear of the third, the fear of creating, the fear of existing outside of one closed identity, which is extrinsically created, is our oppression. So let me just emphasize this point and hopefully make it clear. In that, the extrinsic structure gives us a habitual way to understand ourselves, but it is by definition inauthentic because it's just a habit. It was constructed for us. We're just going along with it because what else can we do? There's nothing we can do. We're helpless. But it's inauthentic. Now, that inauthentic relationship is now defining all of our other relationships, right? So if we want to make a change, we can't, or feel that we can't, because we would lose, and this is the grand irony of all this, we would lose the inauthentic relationship. But losing the inauthentic relationship is the point of freedom. You could, in a sense, boil freedom down to the act of transcending or breaking down the habitual relationships that are, by definition, confining relationships. It's not that you're free to do whatever you want and to harm people. It's that you are free to interact in a way that genuinely creates this intersubjective space, these intersubjective experiences that are unique to the dynamic. But if we're in a world of generic forms, how much space is there to be unique? And this is, I think, in a fundamental way what we're up against, because if we're trying to make everybody vote the same way, think the same way, be angry the same way, be happy the same way, if we are trying to make everything generic, then the structure of teacher, student, man, woman, of different races and so on is there to order our experience. However, our human experience through our attachment bonds and our connections and our intersubjective experiences is to create beyond ourselves, not to take the burden and the responsibility of the entire world as a series of constructs about gender, race, and so on, and place it upon our shoulders and say, well, I'm going to be my best self as a means to combat this issue. I'm going to do my part. I'm going to focus on my little this. I'm going to just say, well, there's nothing I can do. I'm going to say, I'm going to give up. I'm going to give up with a reason, but I'm going to give up because I don't really have control over these systems. Yet, in order to engage in our own freedom, we have to in some way engage in this barrier, this kind of ceiling, if you will, that we are banging our heads against. Now, what I'm suggesting is we can do that in a number of ways. It's not that everybody should do the same thing to be free, because that would be the paradox, right? We'd be saying, oh, well, we should all be free. Now let's just do that in the same way. It's actually supposed to move towards an increased sense of complexity. The burden of the father is really the burden of the mother and the burden of our previous generations, insofar as, from a structural perspective, is about shifting to be more inclusive, more complex. And what we find now, and what every generation finds, is a tension between the old and the new. Which is to say, we're finding a tension between the expression of ourselves in the world as authentic in the face of a system we feel to be inauthentic that other generations felt to be authentic. So this is not a linear story that we would see in the silver screen, right? This is complex. It is a mess. It is a pile of things. It's colliding and intersecting in all sorts of different ways. It's a motet of a million voices, right? It is polyphony beyond what anybody has ever imagined. And in that, however, there is an awareness that, okay, because this polyphony is so broad and so expansive, this can actually be a reason to explore. In other words, if we start to think to ourselves, okay, there are so many voices, there is a clear tendency to grow and expand from previous experiences. You can repress and deny and do all the rest of it, but nonetheless, those are still in relation to some form of change. Once we start to recognize that change is an inevitable, then our unchanging position is to accept change. Whereas if we view change as danger, then we try and lock change in a closet or in some compartment and say, well, this is how gender works. This is how the teacher-student dynamic works to be educated. This is how race works. All of these different things. But it doesn't acknowledge change. It doesn't acknowledge that underlying, and I'll say it again, underlying this notion of change is that change is itself the unchanging, right? It is the constant. And if we can embrace that and open ourselves to that experience, then all of a sudden, the ways in which we are defined move and shift. All of a sudden, what we are extrinsically defined as, whether it's man, woman, the color of our skin, the dynamic of a relationship like teacher-student, all of a sudden, we start to sense that there is something more to our existence beyond what we are doing, that we are being in the world, expressions in the world, and that this being intersects with other people and creates. And this complexity of creation starts to flow. And from this flowing is a sense and a feeling of freedom. It is authentic insofar as we are not seeking to adhere, but rather we are seeking to be with, to be of. So I hope this has been an interesting way to start to think a little bit about the extrinsic side of identity and the way in which we are in relationship to this extrinsic dynamic of identity, and that we can explore change as being a constant, as being unchanging. And that may open us to potential. And this potential may lead us in a way to ideas and experiences that we find in our connections with others, as opposed to defining as our relationships based upon some extrinsic system. So as always, you can find me at jordanoconnor.com. Otherwise, bye for now.